I'm Alan Lucas, the senior rabbi here at Temple Beth Sholom, and I'm thrilled tonight to welcome colleagues and friends, Rabbi Michael White, senior rabbi of our next-door neighbor, Temple Sinai, Mother Margaret Peckham Clark, the rector of Trinity Church, Margaret has been the rector there for the last 15 years, but unfortunate for us, unfortunate for her, she'll be leaving shortly to assume the post of Canon for Congregational Life, the Diocese of Newark, and she'll be working directly with the bishop, and it's a wonderfully prestigious position. We're happy for you, we're sad for us.
Actually.
Can you imagine someone leaving their congregation? What a terrible.
And leaving the North Shore of Long Island.
Tonight we commemorate Yom Hashoah. For most of my career, I have been loath to make analogies to the Shoah because it is my fundamental opinion that the Shoah is unique. To call someone a Nazi is not to understand the true evil of the Nazis. To liken something to what the Nazis did is to misunderstand the depth of the depravity of the Holocaust and what it represents. And yet, after all these years of carefully avoiding these comparisons, how can we not wonder if today the unthinkable is once again thinkable? And the America we have come to cherish might not be the safe haven that we thought it was. We pause now for a moment of silence to remember Lori Gilbert Kay, who was killed last Shabbat in Poland at the Chabad House. We pause for a moment of silence to remember those killed in Christian churches in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday. We pause for a moment of silence to remember those killed in 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. And we pause for a moment of silence to remember the souls who were killed at Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh only 6 months ago. We pause for a moment of silence to remember all those who were injured, to remember all those who have been traumatized by these events and too many others. We pause now for a moment of silence. My question for my colleagues is, do you believe that synagogues, these attacks on synagogues, mosques, and churches, do you believe that they all come from the same place?
I do. And I believe that they are also distinct in some ways, and I think it's important to understand that both historically and as far as tracing the rise of different extremists around the world. I do think they are connected to a modern understanding among extremists that often means that those who consider themselves in some way fundamentalist from whatever religious tradition they arise actually have more in connection to each other than they do to the faith traditions they purport to represent. And so I think that for many years now we have been able to say that extremism and the terrorism that flows from it and the fundamentalism that it purports to represent is really its own movement and its own threat to people of goodwill and people of faith, even among very distinct traditions.
So I want to recommend 2 books to all of you that are recent publications. The first is by a Washington Post journalist named Eli Saslow. It's called Rising Out of Hate. And the second is called Antisemitism Here and Now, and it's written by the foremost scholar in the world on anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, who you can hear at Temple Sinai this coming year. And they both make, for what for me was a really terrifying revelation. They teach about how vast and how sophisticated the network of the alt-right and white supremacy is in America. There are millions of them. And we don't know who they are, we don't know where they are, save if you go to the various websites like Stormtrooper, which they have created. And one of the revelations that I learned in Eli Saslow's book that I want to share with you specifically about anti-Semitism is that he writes that there was a debate among white nationalists about whether Jews are white. Now this, he says, is the crux of why anti-Semitism is the fuel that fuels all the other hatreds. Hatreds against people of color, against immigrants, against Muslims, against gays, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he writes that those on the far left say that Jews are white. We're white. Now, why is that important? Because it means that they can then follow up that characterization by calling us colonists, by calling us the folks who hoard all of the money, the folks who oppress and tyrannize others, the ones who manipulate economies and governments for our own interests. So for anti-Semites on the far left, we're white. For those on the far right, we are not white. And because we are not white, because for them, white is pure, white is blessed, so because we are not white, they can target us with all of the slurs and the bigotry that they attach to people of color. We're parasites. We suck the life and the energy out of every society that we infect. So Saslow teaches and Lipstadt teaches that is the fusion of these two characterizations, that on the one hand, we're all powerful, cunning, and manipulative, and we control the world, and on the other hand, we are parasitic, and we suck the energy out of every society because of how weak we are, and all we know how to do is take. It is this contradictory fusion of these two myths that gives power to anti-Semitism. And what these scholars teach us is that anti-Semitism is the original hatred. All other hatreds arise from their hatred of Jews. And what we're seeing is the manifestation of that in public now, because these folks now consider this to becoming more normalized. Deborah Lipstadt says that the revelation of Charlottesville for her was that there were no Nazi uniforms and there were no sheets. That in that protest and in the ones that followed, these white nationalists wore khakis and polo shirts. And Richard Spencer said the goal is to normalize us. It is to make white nationalism a normal and accepted ideology in America, and we're seeing the fruition of that as well.
Mother Margaret, Rabbi White touched on my next question. I want to give you a chance to respond to it. Do you think that there is any difference between anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Semitism on the right?
I think that Rabbi White did a wonderful job of summarizing how they can appear to be different but really fuse. And what I would like to speak a little bit about is, while I love the Christian scriptures and certainly hold them in high esteem, it's important to understand that some of the roots of this, both on the right and the left, are derived from simplistic and not helpful understandings of the Christian scripture. And the understanding that the faith of Christians is to be defined over and against our Jewish brothers and sisters rather than together with them. And so I think it's important to understand that if you can go back millennia, and that is part of the source of this, and then it becomes entwined and fused, to use Rabbi White's word, with all kinds of other political and power ideologies, and it can sometimes manifest slightly differently, but it really has, I think, in many ways the same root, and it's important to acknowledge that and to work against that.
Those on the far right and on the far left think that the Democrats and the Republicans are the same thing. They're all the same evil. They're all the same evil. What scares me more is the way that mainstream politicians on both the right and the left have decided to use Jews and Israel as a political football. That should scare you. That should scare you. It's that for those on the left who have adopted this perspective, you cannot be a warrior for social justice. You cannot care about human rights if you are a Zionist. That should scare you. And for those on the right who have decided to use us in this way, if you are left of center politically, then you don't care about Israel, you don't care about BDS, and you don't care about anti-Semitism. We are being used, and we're being used by mainstream politicians to make a short-term political point and for short-term political gain. And that's what we should fight. What the bigots on the far left and the far right want most of all is to divide us. And they are being manipulated they are manipulating mainstream politicians to do just that. And that's what we should fight.
And if I could share an observation, it's interesting that as the definition or the perception of what a Jew is has changed, with it has changed the nature of anti-Semitism. The constant is that they hate Jews, but their perception of what a Jew is has evolved. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, when Judaism was definitely perceived as a religion, you found the most virulent forms of religious anti-Semitism, Christ killers. Then, as it evolved into Germany and before World War II, there was a notion that Jews were an ethnicity, and therefore you found the racial anti-Semitism that was embraced by the Nazis. And in our period, with the revival of the State of Israel and the pride that we as Jews take in our return home after thousands of years, it is this virulent anti-Israel, anti-Zionism that becomes the expression. And some people will say, well, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Israel. But the truth is that that's what they perceive Jews to be. It's no coincidence that in places like University of Michigan, those who want to protest Israel march in front of the synagogue and see no distinction in that, because today the synagogue is a place not of religion for them, but it is Jewish identity, which is Israel. And so, since we have other items on our agenda, I'll end with one question for the two of you. There's a dilemma that we confront in the sense that we want our houses of worship to be open. And yet, when they're open to everyone, some of the people that are coming in are people who wish us great harm. What can we do? What should we do to make our houses of worship safer? And what shouldn't we do?
Well, look, the highest priority those of us who lead religious institutions is to the safety and the security of the people who enter our doors. I'm sure here at Beth Sholom, as we at Temple Sinai I'm sure you're having the same conversations that we've been having. Every day, 300 children come in and out of our building, sometimes more. So safety and security is a priority, and it makes me nauseous that we are spending the money that we are spending on security. It literally makes me nauseous. That we're not spending it on Torah, that we're not spending it on our social justice work, that we're not spending it on our teen programming, but that we're spending it on security. It just makes me sick. And yet, this is what we have to do. The one thing I will say is that I have been very firm in my teaching to my congregation that we cannot allow those bigots to change who we are. We cannot allow them to turn us inward. We cannot allow them to coerce us into retreating from our mission as Jews and our mission to the greater community. We will not allow them to do that. Being here tonight is an antidote to them. Being here on Shabbos, being in this shul and in our shul and in all liberal religious institutions that care about compassion and decency and dignity, being in your shul, studying, celebrating, worshiping, this is the antidote to that hate. We must never retreat. We must never allow them to define who we are. We will continue to define who we are as proud, caring Jews.
I would agree wholeheartedly that memory and prayer and speech and gathering together and making community are the way we stand against the darkness. We have to care for our people and we have to care for each other. And we have to find ways that we can do that without becoming like those we are striving to defeat.
And I certainly want to echo Rabbi White's sense that your presence here tonight is our response. They want to make us afraid, and we refuse to be afraid. Your presence here tonight is a memorial not only to those who died to the Shoah, to the Holocaust, but an affirmation of those in our generation who will live proudly as Jews. And I would also like to say, some of my congregants have heard me say this before, but I'll say it again and again, that please, as you leave tonight, say thank you to the guards who are outside. These wonderful people are literally our line of defense, are putting themselves potentially in harm's way so we can sit here in safety and security. Say thank you. I want to thank Rabbi White, and I want to wish Mother Margaret a great journey to her next position. We'll miss you. One of the things that I hope you appreciate is in this community, we really like each other, right? And we really care for each other. And I hope that's reflected in the communities that we've created, that you too will share that sense of love and joy that is what we should all be creating as our response to hate. Thank you.